In January 2016, Alireza Firouzja was just 12 years old and already playing in the Iranian National Championships. In this game, he faced the reigning champion Ehsan Ghaem Maghami, who outrated him by 150 points, so a very strong opponent. And Firouzja called this victory the most meaningful game of his career. And he said this in a stream in 2019, so thanks to Durant for pointing this out to me in the comments. And if anyone else has any suggestions for games to cover, then please do let me know. So Firouzja had black here, and we saw this King's Indian defence on the board, and we had this accelerated Averbach variation. So this is where white brings the bishop out to g5, and it happens very early in this game. And after these standard opening moves, pawn to d6, here we had an unusual move, queen to d2. More common here is bishop to e2, and then you're transposing to the main lines. But okay, queen to d2 was played, and this does actually prevent e5 here. You can't do that in these positions, because after takes, the queens come off, rook recaptures, knight d5 is just killing, so you can't play like this. So coming back here, instead of e5, we had pawn to c5, a standard break in these structures, and d5 takes the space in the centre. And black can't live for very long with such a huge clamp on the position, so pawn to e6 is very standard, going in for a kind of Benoni style structure, and after pawn to f3, which is standard, takes, white's now set up this really nice pawn chain in the centre, but black will look to get play on the queen side later, and sometimes breaks with pawn to f5 as well. So now we had pawn to a6, preparing that b5 advance. And most common from white here is to actually play pawn to a4 and clamp down on that move. But instead we had the immediate knight g to e2. This knight is coming to g3, very standard. And after pawn to b5, white's not actually minding black to gain this space and kick on with b4. You can tell this is really a pet system here. He knows where this knight is going later, and he's ready to meet that move. So we had knight to g3 now. Just a quick one, if white had tried to get really aggressive here with say pawn to h4, well knight b to d7 and then let's say g4, black does actually get good play after knight e5. This one's attacked, you'd have to defend it. Now you get b4, knight d1, and a5 is nice, clearing the way for the bishop. You're then looking at this d3 square soon. So black actually gets a lot of play if you just try and kill them immediately, and you're not actually crashing through straight away. So that's why instead white goes for the more positional knight to g3 here in this position after b5. And now we had rook to e8 coming to that open file or half open file, bishop to e2, knight b to d7, castles, and rook to b8, preparing to start the standard queenside play. And now white goes king to h1, which is perhaps a little slow, although its prophylaxis coming off this diagonal, maybe better would have been the immediate rook to e1 or knight to d1 here. But okay, we had that move, and now Firouzja plays a little bit slowly as well. I mean, remember, he's just 12 years old at the time, so arguably this queen should be sitting on b6 here, or maybe c7, playing on the queen side, but he goes queen to e7 here. And we'll see the point of this, that he's looking to break the pin. So we first had pawn to a4 undermining this chain. b4 comes now, knight to d1 and queen to f8. So he's broken the pin, and he's also setting up playing h6 here, as we'll see. But you can see that the queen just looks a bit passive there, you know, stuck on f8. So knight to f2 now, that knight remaneuvers, it supports e4. I mean, the dream here for white, if you can arrange it, is to get f4, e5 and just completely steamroll black through the centre. So pawn to h6, the bishop drops back, and now pawn to h5. Might look slightly curious to play like this, but if white comes back, well, now knight to h7 is quite strong, and you get good play on the dark squares. Let's say bishop h4. You're getting good play on all of these squares here, quite a bit of play. So we didn't have this played. After pawn to h5, we had rook f to e1, good move. Although these pieces stand in the way right now, as mentioned, if you can clear them out of the way and push e5, you'll be doing quite well. And now Firouzja needs to find some kind of plan. Probably best was knight to e5 here, You can't go f4 immediately or you get good play with this move. However, you could prepare that move more slowly. White has lots of improving moves. It's tricky for black because the pieces are just all a bit cramped, as we can see. But instead of this, Firouzja plays a poor positional move. You can tell he's still a young player at this point. He plays pawn to a5, giving this b5 square, which isn't a good move because now bishop to b5 comes immediately, massively improving that bishop. And look at the problems down this diagonal, completely shuts out the rook. So bishop to b7 now comes developing, knight to f1, and rook e to c8 now, trying to get this c4 break in because that's really now the only source of counterplay that black is going to have. So rook a to c1 seeks to shut that down, knight to b6 starts to prepare it again, queen c2 now adds more protection to this square, and now you want to push c4 as black, but then your knight is hanging here on b6. So this knight comes back to defend its brother, and now again you're threatening to go c4, so here white needs to clamp down on this square for another time, and the best way to do this is with pawn to b3, just battening down the hatches in a really solid way, because now if you push c4, you can simply take here, and after knight takes, bishop takes, if you try and win the piece back with this pin, well actually white just has queen b3 and they're fine. So you can't do that after the pawn comes to b3. But what white did in the game was come with the knight to d2 to protect this square. But Firouzja finds the brilliant pawn to c4. Now he can make this push because it's not working tactically for white. If you take this pawn with the knight, then we recapture here, bishop recaptures, and now we have this pin. If you try queen to b3 like before, then we can just take, the rook recaptures, and after the smoke clears on these exchanges, you pick up this b2 pawn, and black is doing well here because although the material is level, you're actually running this one down the board with great effect. And coming back here, if instead of this you try pawn to b3, well still we have takes, because after recaptures, we now have pawn to b3, and again this passed pawn supported by rook and bishop is deciding the game. Really bad for white. So coming back here, white sees this, and that's why after pawn to c4 the knight didn't capture here. Instead we saw queen to b1 now, but we can see that Firouzja's now taken the initiative. Pawn to c3 now comes, good move. This one was captured, the bishop took back, and knight d1 hits this bishop. Now you don't want to retreat to g7 here, or knight b3 comes and this one's under fire, you're in some trouble. But instead of this, Firouzja correctly gives up that bishop for the knight, we had the recapture, and now he takes this rook on c1. If the queen takes, we'll bring our rook to the c-file, so instead we had the bishop recapturing, and now knight to c5, hitting that beautiful square. And here white should have tried bishop to e3, coming back to this beautiful diagonal, hitting both of these knights, but instead we had knight to b2, an imprecise move that now allows bishop a6, which wasn't possible in the previous variation. And the problem here is that these ones now get exchanged, the knight recaptures, and you've gotten rid of that monster piece, opened up the rook. Now we had bishop e3, but it's a move too late, because knight c5 comes, and you don't want to capture this, or the pawn recaptures, and these ones are looking very menacing. Black's connected passed pawns are just a bit more powerful here than white's passed pawn. So coming back here, instead of capturing the knight, white played queen to d1. This pawn's under fire by two pieces, and so this defends. But queen to e8 attacks it for a third time, and that's why white now does feel obliged to take off that knight. The pawn recaptured, the queen came to b3, and now queen to e5 is an excellent move, finally centralising the queen and bringing it into the danger zone. And now it's really tricky for white to play. You might wonder about, say, knight c4 blockading, but then you can actually just take this one, the queen recaptures, and queen c3 is really powerful, hitting both of these pieces. Let's say the queen captures here, it's difficult to know what to play. Well, now pawn recaptures, king g1, pawn c2, king f1, and rook b1 comes and there's nothing you can do. And coming back here, if you don't start bringing that queen in, if you come straight in front of the pawn, well then pawn to c2. You can't capture because of back rank issues. And now if you try king g1, well we just have rook b2, b1 rather, in the game as one. And we'll see similar themes in the game here. So coming back to this position, white didn't go knight c4. Instead rook d1 was tried, desperately trying to push this pawn. Now we had queen c3 anyway. The queen chopped here, difficult to know what to suggest. Pawn recaptured, knight d3 hits this one. And now an excellent move from Firouzja. Watch this for a combination. Pawn to c2, rook to c1. And now if you want to pause the video and find the best move in the position, then please do so. And if you're enjoying this one, do smash that subscribe button. We had knight takes on d5. Awesome move. And it's a really beautiful concept. So if this knight is recaptured, then we have rook to b1. And the threat here is to play pawn to c4, kicking the knight. So say you played a random move like king to g1, then pawn to c4 comes and we can see this knight is overloaded. But if white instead played, say, pawn to d6, well, the king has to come across to stop that one. So we could have a line like this. Let's say white chucks the pawn and black recaptures. The point here is that white is getting into a zugzwang. So we now have a threat to play c4 again, winning the rook. So the rook would have to come to g1. And now rook d1 is precise, hitting this knight. And it forces it to c1 here. And now the killer move is h4. It's winning anyway without this move, but this is really beautiful. Because now if you try g3 or g4 as white, whatever, we go pawn to h3, and the king is completely boxed in. You're just going to march your king in and there's nothing can be done. And if you try pawn to h3 here, again, the king can do nothing but shuffle. Beautiful concept. But coming back here, the knight wasn't captured on d5. Instead of this, we had the rook captures here. But now this allowed another amazing shot, knight to b4. Not only hitting both of these, but also creating back rank threats. So you can't go here, for example, or takes, and you can't take back, or we have this checkmate. So instead of this, the knight was captured, but now A takes on b4. That's crucial, creating these connected passed pawns. We had rook takes here, the pawn pushed on, rook c1, pawn b2, rook b1, and now rook c8 was the final move of the game. Again, you can't win the pawn, and we have this checkmate. And if you do something like king g1, well, now we're checking here and we're making a queen or winning the rook. An amazing game from 12-year-old Firouzja, and it helped him win the Iranian Championship. If you want to see another game from when he was just 15 years old, then click here, and to subscribe to the channel, click here. Thanks very much for watching and see you soon.